Welcome back to the Heart and Science of Creative Leadership podcast. This week, we're really excited to have a friend of mine and a new friend, if you will, but certainly someone Aarti's known for a number of years in the industry, just because he's a real big figure in the industry. Had global leadership jobs with one of the biggest agencies in the world. Was an entrepreneur immediately out of that. Thought about being an entrepreneur earlier than that, but came out, bought into a small Texas firm. Then you may have heard of him from Pulse Point. Then that got bought, and then he started his own firm called Legend Labs. And that's where he is nowadays. And he's there with two other partners, and there's about 20 to 30 years difference in age. And so I think you're going to learn a lot in this episode. But one of the things I really want to point out is this distinction around owners and partners that have a little bit of gap in age, and the benefits, but also some of the weaknesses that come in from that. Aarti, I know in this conversation, we highlighted some of the pros and some of the cons of that point.
Yeah. And for our listeners, one of the big jobs that Jeff had was he was at GCI Health when it was when it merged or it was taken over by Conan Wolf. And to your point about the cross-generational partnerships, my question is how do you foster equality? And from what Jeff said, right? I mean, they are all three of them are equal partners. When one person is perceived as being more senior, both by your talent, your people, but also by your clients. And I think a listener should listen for what's that sort of the informal burden that the sort of senior person takes on the back of that.
Yeah, and I think we talk about that specifically when we talked about the formal structures they've had set up, but also then just the informals that are set up. So I think we're going to have a great conversation with Jeff Hunt, one of the partners at now Legend Labs. So hope you enjoy, and we will talk to you again on the backside. The first question is, you built and started Pulse Point with Bob. You went through some events of sale and transition there, and now you have Legend Labs. Having been in a startup mode a couple of times, what advice do you have for other entrepreneurs looking to start up firms? And that just lets you talk about the industry today, what it was, what it is, and really sort of a real nice green field for you. And that'll be kind of where we start.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that I might start at one chapter before Pulse Point, because it's kind of gave me an opportunity to test drive this thing called entrepreneurship in a structured way. So if you don't mind, so when I left Burson in 2000, I moved back to Texas. I bought into a firm called Reed Poland that was run by Julian Reed for 50 years, and I bought 20% of it. And we sold majority interest to Gray Global Group. And I had an earnout. It was a sleepy little firm, old, but he was my hero. And, we won the Dell business right out of the gate on a wing and a prayer, because if you came into his offices, it was all typewriters. So we won the Dell business. And that was
you and I standing at fax machines.
Exactly. And that was right when the digital social revolution was catching fire. Clue Train Manifesto had come out, and everybody was going crazy. And Dell was in the crosshairs through something called Dell Hell.
I remember Dell Hell.
So, yeah. And so I did that, and I had essentially a 5-year runway, which was 1 year was a gifted year, and then I had 4 years to get the earnout. And about 4 years in, Gray sold to WPP. I still had another year. Bob left, and I became CEO of GCI, the global company. I still had money on the table, so we had to do a little negotiating because my interest moved from just being Texas and that P&L, which is what I was going to be incentivized on, to the global P&L. So we had to do a little negotiating, did that, and a year later finished, stayed on for a little bit longer. Then we merged with Conan Wolf, and that's when I exited Stage Right, and that's when Bob and I hooked up to create Pulse Point Group. But the reason I tell the story is because Yeah, I mean, it was an entrepreneurial leap of faith, to go and buy 20%. And by the way, it was right at 2000. You can remember the economy. It was a tough economy. Matter of fact, Gray told me that if we didn't do the deal that week, the very week we did it, the week after it would not have gotten done, because the financial situation.
Well, let's just keep this thread, and then we can circle back. When did you know you were at a big agency? And Bob Feldman, we talked to Bob. Bob tells a story about you being a young PRSA student at UT and did some work for him. When did entrepreneurism, you did the big firm and all, I was there too, big perks, all the great things that you get. When did you know as a man that entrepreneurism was right for you?
I was literally 18 months into the job at Burson Marsteller. Bob Feldman, Rob Flaherty, and I were really good friends. We were all in Bob's.
This is right out of school? This is like right out of school. Yeah, okay.
Bob was my boss's boss's boss. So he was way up there. But Bob hired me at Burson. And so we had this idea to start Feldman, Flaherty, and Hunt. And we developed a business plan. We still have it. We went out and looked at some property out in Connecticut that Bob's then father-in-law had a printing company, so he had office space. And we were ready to go. I mean, we were ready to do it. Actually, it wasn't 18 months. It was a little bit further in because Bob had just bought a house in Westchester. And so, he was feeling the pressure of needing financial stability. And ultimately, he's the one that I think started pulling the plug on the idea. And that's when I went to Korea, because I was like, I'm not going to just sit here in New York. So that's when I moved to Korea. And I think that's another, part of the story is that every 2 to 3 years at Burson, I was given a new, what you would call entrepreneurial opportunity. I just had the luxury of, big, deep pockets to fund it. But like Korea was a startup. And then from Korea, I went to Mexico City. That was a startup. And then from Mexico to Miami to open up Latin America, all of which were organic startups, no acquisitions. But again, there's a lot of difference between doing it with somebody else's money and doing it with your own money.
I wanted to ask a follow-up because I think pretty much anyone listening to this obviously will know Bob Feldman, they'll know Rob Flaherty, and of course you, Jeff Hunt. What was it? Because we've talked to a lot of guests about partnerships and finding that those complementary people who you're like, what, we can do this together. We can build something together. And I always think, now that you've said this, I think about what that firm would have turned into if the three of you had actually gotten it off the ground. But what was it that do you think brought the three of you together and said, hey, like we can make something happen?
I think enormous mutual respect and unique talent lanes. By that, I mean, Rob Flaherty is one of the most creative people I've ever worked with. There's unique people that have the ability to think right brain, left brain. He's one of those people. And so always just had enormous respect for him. We were kind of peers. He's just a little senior to me, but we were kind of peers, but I just had enormous respect. And then Bob was more like a mentor figure, but had just incredible client skills. And we all kind of learned from the way he managed clients, managed growth. And then, friends. We were just really good friends. And, we kind of started this off by talking about the importance of that. But there's a lot to be said, for trusting friendships.
So would you give the advice that as a new college graduate, 25, 26, 27 today, that they could leave, start their own firm, be what we would call kind of a high strategy, low tactics firm? Or is there benefit in going into a bigger firm, learning some best practices for 5 years, something like that? So navigate that fork in the road and that decision for a 25, 27-year-old today.
Yeah, I think both the ability to get into the bigger firms or even mid-sized firms, frankly, and also getting out of your comfort zone. By that, I would usually mean your market. So I don't think there's a better place to start a career than New York or Chicago or London. So kind of getting out of your comfort zone and then getting into a structured environment, because as you know, there's so much that you have to learn about people management, client management, financials, all the other things that it takes beyond the strategy and the consulting that you might be good at.
So there's value in that stop before, even if you are a passionate entrepreneurial 18-year-old and you know you're going to start a firm in less than 10 years, your thought is make that stop.
Absolutely.
Systems stop before you go do your own thing. Yeah, awesome.
I guess following up on that, I know there are entrepreneurs that are listening that are either, early in their entrepreneurial journey, or they are not at a stage in life where they're going to drop everything and move to New York or move overseas. So for someone who has not done their tour of duty at a big agency, or they haven't really worked in a market outside of the one that maybe they grew up in, maybe they went to college in, what are the watch outs that you would tell them on this call that they need to be aware of and where their blind spots might be?
It's kind of interesting because I think there's a certain breed who are fearless. And I wasn't one of those type of people. I had fear, probably because I got married right out of college, right? And so I felt like I needed to make sure that I could, make ends meet, right? And that's kind of the fear that Bob had. Bob was the only one that had a mortgage. Rob and I were footloose and fancy free. Bob had a mortgage. That was the anchor. So I would just say I wouldn't want to do anything to stifle their boundless, unfearful attitude. If they have it, I would say go for it. Because one of the biggest questions that Bob and I both asked ourselves, like when we were at Pulse Point Group, and Bob told me because he had another firm before that, he said, Jeff, in 5 years, I promise you're going to say, why didn't we do this 25 years ago? And it's so true. I'm sure, Bill, you've probably said that to yourself too. And so you can look back and, you can sort of be grateful for all the experiences, but you can also look back and say, well, what if I would have just thrown caution to the wind? So I would personally, if they have that attitude, if they have that courage, I would say go for it. But not everybody has that courage.
So there's the other side of that coin. There's the courage. And so I talk a lot about competence and confidence. So the courage is a derivative of confidence. When I look back at what you shared with Reed Poland, then Pulse Point, then now Legends Lab, they're what we would call kind of high strategy, low tactics, really C-suite advisors and whisperers. If I'm that younger entrepreneur with great confidence, I probably have not advised a whole lot of CEOs and may be lacking in competence. And so talk a little bit about that high strategy, low tactic. How does that blend with the go for it mentality that you're advocating? If that's the type of firm, because that's obviously the type of firm you have found your success in, is high strategy, low tactic. How do you counsel and coach that entrepreneur that, oh my God, I can tell a CEO what to do because I'm on TikTok? Balance that out for me a little bit.
I think that they need to be mindful of where they're going to be credible and where they're not going to be credible. So I think they could counsel a CEO on a TikTok strategy, but to think that they're going to go in and counsel a CEO on how he needs to position himself to take on a threat from the UAW who might be striking 10 other plants, I'm sorry, you just haven't had the experience. But you do have, if you're the type of person you described, that unique knowledge about TikTok. And so, they'll take your counsel all day. And in some respects, a youthful perspective is often appreciated because the dynamics, as you know, of the workplace are changing so rapidly. And it's getting tougher and tougher to recruit and then to keep these young people. And so somebody that has sort of the confidence, as you said, to say, I know what it takes and I can advise you on how you keep young people motivated, I think they would have a marketplace for that.
Yeah. Hey, Aarti, this is directly related to what you and I are talking about technical firms versus consultancy firms, is that, yes, you could sell this plumbing skill, TikTok, versus that experience. So it's an interesting thing that you and I visited
Right.
on.
But I think TikTok doesn't exist in a vacuum anymore, right? I mean, all you have to do is look at what happened to Shein or countless other companies to know that like it's a corporate reputation issue that should ladder all the way up to the CEO, right? You shouldn't, it's not just the social media manager at an organization or even just the head of marketing that should care about TikTok and how that's going to impact the company's reputation. But I want to ask a follow-up to what you're saying. I like, Jeff, your point about, you have to know where you're going to be credible. But I don't think all of these entrepreneurs are necessarily young folks that have never, just because they've never worked at a large agency. Sometimes they spent a decade or more at whatever the big game in town is, at whatever their regional agency is, right? And now they want to hang up a shingle elsewhere. The pitfalls that I've seen, working with, when I talk to agency owners who don't have the pedigree necessarily, Jeff, that you bring to the game, they tend to have an inflated sense of their own capabilities. Like the number of times I've heard them say, well, nobody else is doing X. I'm like, no, you're not. I promise you're not the only agency doing this. And they also tend to take things really personally. So whether that's when an employee leaves or when a client leaves, or if they don't win an award in a PR competition. And those are two things that I feel like some of the kind of watch outs that I've seen with entrepreneurs who haven't had the bigger agency or even the corporate experience that you've had, Jeff.
Yeah, I would say, I've used this analogy before, I can go into Napa Valley and get some of the best grapes in the world and put them in a bottle. And if I start drinking it, 6 months later, it's just not going to taste that great. But if I leave it in a bottle, for 5 years, it's beautiful, right? And so, that's probably a simplistic way to think about it, but there's no substitute for experience and aging. It's funny. When I was younger, I was always the youngest person, and I had this complex because I was 26 and I was in Seoul, Korea. So I spent the first, 25 years of my career wishing I looked and was perceived to be older. And now I'm spending the last, 10 years wishing I looked and was perceived to be younger. So there was probably a little bit in there, probably like 5 years when it was just perfect.
Yeah.
But other than that, you're either too young or too old.
Bill, you asked someone on this podcast their age. And I have to admit, I cringed when you did that a little bit because this is an ageist industry, right? I mean, maybe less so for crisis and kind of the lane that you play in, Jeff. But I mean, if you want to be hired to, if you're a trend forecaster, right? I mean, we trust people, young people, to be at the forefront of that.
But if you want a war room, that has a little bit of knowledge and experience, been to the movie, you don't want a 17-year-old. You want a 62-year-old.
Yeah, but the rate at which the world is changing, right? I wonder how much do you think experience matters? Because a lot of entrepreneurs that I talk to will say, well, sure, all the other games in town may be folks that are over 60, but they're not, as we talked about a moment ago, they're not digital natives. They don't understand how a single TikTok could completely derail a company's reputation, or the power of a single tweet. And I don't think you have to be young to understand these digital mediums at all. I think some of the folks that I follow are over a certain age. But I mean, how do you think that mix between experience and sort of expertise, right, in some of these new platforms? What do you think that mix is today?
Well, now you're hitting on something that I think is a very practical discussion that I could offer some comments on. When I was younger, I always hung out with older people. So like Julian Reed, who was the guy that I bought his company, Julian was like, 80. I did a lot of work directly with Harold Burson. So when I was younger, I always tried to hang out with older people to kind of suck in the wisdom and the knowledge. And as I've gotten older, part of the reason I love teaching at the University of Texas for the last 20 years is it keeps me current because I have to keep up with these kids, these students. But the other thing is, if you look at my partners now in Legend Labs, they're 32, 33, 34. I'm 62, right? So I think, if you're a young entrepreneur, maybe some words of advice or wisdom is pick some older mentors or even partners. I mean, that what's the guy's name in Houston that runs the firm?
Pierpont.
Pierpont, yep. Mm-hmm.
Pierpont. He's got Terry Haymeyer hanging out in there for the last 10 or 15 years because Terry's, had all this great experience, and he's an excellent role model for a lot of the younger people in the firm. But I think if you're younger and you're an entrepreneur,
and we've talked about mentors. That. And we love that. And I think just to go on a tangent for a second, the folks that I'm talking to sort of these sort of 50 to 65-year-old entrepreneurs. They've got agencies, big, small, somewhere in between. Lots of locked up equity. They're trying to figure out what's next. The buying market for that size firm is not huge. They may or may not have the employees to transition. I'm advocating, why don't you go look for a 32-year-old that's got a struggling firm, but a lot of energy, and you guys marry up. You might not get the big multi-million-dollar paycheck, but you can have peace of mind that 32 bolted on with your 57 could be a pretty dynamic firm. It's just the bubble, the baby boomers bubble kind of moving through the economy. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in doing that, but doing it strategically and intentionally, because there's this locked up capital that needs to be released by someone in their 30s. And I think it's a big strategy people need to think about.
Yeah.
But what about so when you have cross-generational leadership or partnerships, do you feel like, can you be equals? So Jeff, do you feel like equals with your partners who are in their 30s?
Yeah, I intentionally set it up that way. So Legend Labs, we are 3 equal partners. I mean, equal in every sense of the word. Compensation. I mean, you could argue that my compensation should probably be 30, 40% higher than based on where I am in my career. Equal compensation, equal ownership. And that's the way I really wanted to set it up. That's the way we set it up. And I think that it really just kind of keeps me, seeking their advice, which I should do, right? And vice versa, because we're just equal. And we know what we each bring to the table. And so it just makes, to me, for a really, a good, and I like what you said earlier, Bill. I think that could be an interesting model, the one you described. And I also like the idea of being very mindful of who you would want to partner with. And, don't pick your clone. You know what I mean? Pick somebody, hopefully, that adds a dimension to your business or to your firm, that adds value.
So let's stay with what you've got now with Legend Labs. So I appreciate formally that's the way it's set up, and I get that, the structures and the way you've designed it and papered it and probably operationalize it. But is there an informal burden that you carry as a senior counselor that pulls through in the way you guys interact? You've been there. You've also got, similar to you and Bob back in the day, you've got the mortgage and kids and a second house or whatever, career, vacation aspirations. So play it out for us. How does it play out informally? I get the formal. Play it out informally. And how does that work?
It's actually probably going to be the opposite of what you would think. Okay. So they have a lot more pressure on them than I have on me relative to all of our people. What do I mean by that? I go out of my way to say, look, we are equal partners. If you want to come bring me a piece of work in midstream, I'll look at it just like they look at it. But for whatever reason, and this is something I'm personally trying to deal with, that I can be a little bit too intimidating to some of our younger people. And they'll feel this need to go to James or to Ahmed before they bring it to me. And it's really not fair because they've got their own work streams, right? But everybody wants to make sure that, before they send it to me, James or Ahmed, and it really burdens them, to be honest with you. It's something that we talk about, in the firm. How do we get our people to just understand that we don't have that kind of structure? We don't want that kind of structure. And a lot of it falls on me.
So let's build on that a little bit. So we've talked a little bit about partners, and now let's talk about the people and how, like, what kind of culture are you trying to build at Legend Labs, and is it different than what you had at Pulse Point, even sort of what you sort of knew at or built at GCI? What are you trying to do differently? Let's start there. Like, what do you want your culture to be?
So when you grow up in the big firms, as you know, there's a lot of crap that comes with it. I mean, culture, baggage, gossip, all that stuff. And so, like, I always remember when Bob and I started Pulse Point Group, we almost completed the sentence, no assholes policy, right? And, we knew exactly what that meant. We just are not going to accept people that, try to bullshit you, try to play games. We're straightforward. We're not big. You come directly. So we're trying to build a culture of very authentic, direct communications, accountability at every level. We're trying to obviously build a creative culture. We're also trying to build an owner culture. So one of the things that we did at Pulse Point, and that we've repeated at Legend Lab, is we created a phantom stock. Where we essentially, there's two things we did. We created a phantom stock, and by the way, it paid off really nicely for people when we sold Pulse Point Group, including my two partners. And, when I say nicely, if you're 28 years old and suddenly you get $150,000 or $200,000, that's better than a poking eye with a sharp stick. And then the other thing that we do at Legend, which is different than at Pulse Point, is we actually put a bonus program in place that we pay quarterly. And why do we do that? Well, I can remember all those years at like Burson where you'd work your ass off the whole year, and you'd get around to December, and one of the operating units would lay an egg, and it would affect everybody's bonus, right? And it could, by the way, then when we got to WPP, it could be like somebody at WPP laid an egg, right? So I like the idea of aligning incentives is closely to the period of time when people are really like doing the work. So what we do, and I'm not saying to say this is like a model for everybody, but what we do is at the end of every quarter, we sit down, we look at our cash flow, we look at our book of business, we look at our, what we see coming, and we look at performance, right? And we give quarterly bonuses. And people
love it.
That's
the three of you sitting together, having that conversation.
That's right.
Okay.
Three of us sitting together. We may go one level deeper on a couple of people to just get some, how do you think she performed or how do you think he performed? But for the most part, it's the three of us, and we do this quarterly distribution. And by the way, we've mostly had quarter over quarter growth every quarter. But we've had a couple of quarters where, we didn't hit the mark. And so people get that direct correlation that was a softer quarter. And we'll have that conversation. We're not afraid to have that conversation to say, hey, look, and we've had this too, you just didn't bring it. So when we're having these tougher conversations with people that we might even need to be counseling out of the firm, they'll first know it, and they'll be disappointed that the bonus they got wasn't what they thought it could be based on what they got, maybe in another quarter when they were performing better. So I like that as a mechanism.
No, I love that. And for me, it was always much nicer to do it quarterly, because that rear view mirror, if you really killed it in the Q1 and Q2, as a manager, it's hard to have that long range rear view mirror. And so at a simple sort of ease of management, to look 90 days is so much easier, let alone all the other benefits of counseling up and counseling down.
Yeah.
When it's really, really super valuable.
And
you guys
again,
bonusing,
speaking practically for these entrepreneurs that you counsel and consult with, being able to get a variable compensation component is not a bad thing when you're running an entrepreneurial startup firm, right? No different than, by the way, using outside freelance talent, right? Because you can kind of like turn it on, turn it off.
So I want to go back to feedback, right? Because that's an important piece that I think some entrepreneurs, they're so focused on building the business that maybe they're not giving the talent the feedback that they need. I think the quarterly Bonus structure, it sounds like that's one way that someone can gauge how they're performing. But how else do you, are there any ways that you encourage your people to provide feedback that's maybe decoupled from money so that it's not necessarily quite as charged?
We do. So we do an annual performance review. And the way that we do ours is it doesn't have to be one of the three partners that does the review. So in other words, you could pick a colleague that you have a lot of respect for. Probably not your direct peer, but maybe just one level above you, but you really respect them. You may not even work with them a lot, but you just love them, you respect them, and they can conduct your review. So what happens is we put this note out. So let's just say I'm conducting somebody's review that doesn't report to me. I'm going to be doing Jane's review, and we would like to have you be one of the people that contributes to this 360 view of how Jane's performing. And by the way, we also ask clients for feedback on this. And so then the information comes in. The partners will review the review before the review is officially done with the employee, because we want to make sure that we kind of understand. But then the review is very structured. It tells them what we think they did really, really well. It always looks at areas of them where we think they can improve, very focused, quantifiable areas where we can improve. And it looks at where we can invest in them. I mean, it literally says, here are one or two invests. So it might say, we're going to invest in a creative writing class for you. And so we always have, money in the pot, right, to invest in people. And I want people to feel like that we are wanting always to help them grow and invest in their careers. And that's how we do it.
Yeah, that's it. I love that. And just what we're finding is that the leaders that are really focused on business development, that's just sort of the first piece of the equation, is you got to have clients. Revenue solves all problems, or all problems are downstream from revenue. But right up there, butting up really close, is culture and people and talent and getting it right. Is it your experience, and Aarti and I were just talking about this, is it your experience that everybody gets that just gets it, that culture is where it's at? Or are you running into entrepreneurs that the conversation stops at revenue solves all problems and cultural, we'll figure that out. I'll have a nice Christmas party and it'll be okay. Do you think everybody just gets it, that culture is so important?
I think that people start their businesses, build their businesses, and it's almost like a sugar high. And it almost is like, it must be the measure, because look how well we're doing, right? And meanwhile, you're rotting at the core. You're losing people out the back end. If you were to do honest people surveys, you'd get raked over the coals. But people, maybe they can't find another job, or maybe the money's good and you're paying them, so they're not going to leave. So we also do we invest a lot in other culture building things. I used to think we're like people would stock their refrigerators with stuff and stacks and
ping pong
tables. And so we don't do any of that kind of stuff, but we, every Wednesday we cater in lunch. It's just, and somebody else, it rotates who's going to choose where we get the lunch and who's going to go get it and bring it in. But every Wednesday we bring in lunch. First Thursday of every month, we do a Thirsty Thursday. Every now and again we go do things, and I don't want to push it on people, right? Because I also believe sometimes that stuff can get overdone. Mm-hmm. Like, just leave me alone. Right. All I want to do is do the work.
Yeah. I mean, are there values that sort of guide how, like, what it should feel like to work at Legend Labs? Like, how do you want an employee to feel working there?
Yeah. I want them to feel authentically communicated with. And by the way, one of my biggest challenges, and I've found this from throughout my career, is people are afraid to give candid feedback. They really are. And like one of my partners is British. They're the worst. They do not like confrontation. They're so polite. They're so gentle. And what used to drive me crazy in the bigger agencies and drives me crazy at Legend Labs is we have a performance problem and the person has no clue. Well, how can they have no clue? I mean, did you tell them that you didn't think that the writing met your, and the answer is usually no, and so I'm a big believer in being extremely direct, very positive, but also if we need to be constructive, and I don't want people to be surprised. I want people to be very self-aware, with our help.
Bill, what we were saying a moment ago about do people know that culture matters? And I'm gonna give a data point that it's worth. I'll probably repeat this, Bill, on some of the other podcasts. So when we did Best Agencies to Work For when I was at Provoke, what we found was there was a correlation between how, an agency that performed really well on Best Agencies to Work For, and then down the line, like within the next year or two, they ended up being an agency of the year. Now, obviously, there's different criteria for each of these, right? Best Agencies to Work For was very much about employee engagement. And then Agency of the Year was very much about business performance. So there was a direct correlation between having an engaged workforce and business performance. So for anyone that's listening that still does not believe us that culture matters, look at our lists of best agencies to work for compared to, look at Provoke Media's lists of best agencies to work for compared to, and then their agencies of the year.
And I get it. And I don't think, and Jeff's doing it in and day out. I still think there's lots of people that know we should diet and exercise and not eat French fries. And there's plenty of us that still do it or don't do it, whatever the context is. And there's plenty of entrepreneurs that's not their aspiration. And that opens that whole conversation. And Jeff, love to get your take on this, is we've been talking about this distinction, a gross distinction in the marketplace of lifestyle firms where entrepreneurs create a firm, $5 to $15 million, maybe, 10 to 20 employees, maybe something like that, whatever that math works out to be. And they are providing an amazing lifestyle. They don't aspire to win awards. They have got their kids' colleges paid for. They may have a second house. They take a great vacation. They don't have any partners, versus performance firms. So it's performance versus lifestyle that are trying to grow, trying to get big. And when they win GE or when they win General Motors or when they win the big ones, that's what they're striving for, versus the lifestyle that's really just trying to build something for a dozen or so people to have a great life. Yeah. Do you agree that sort of ecosystem exists of bucket A and bucket B? And I'd love to get your commentary on where you see Legend Labs in that dichotomy of those two, of a performance firm or a lifestyle firm. And I don't make any judgment on either, because I've came from a performance firm and I built a lifestyle firm, and I'm pretty damn happy with the choice I made. And so I'm an advocate, but I'd love to get your take on the concept and where you think Legend Labs is.
That's a really, really, really good question. And I'll dial back to Bob Feldman, Jeff Hunt days at Pulse Point. And Bob was always a performance guy. I mean, he was like, we didn't do as well this month as we did last month. And I was like, hey, look, dude, I mean, I'm having fun. I love working with clients. So we had that sort of, kind of push-pull, yin-yang kind of thing, right? When we started Legend Labs, we purposely said we're building something. So when we started Pulse Point, by the way, and I think this is something to be mindful of as an entrepreneur, if you know you want to sell your business, the sooner you want to sell your business, and you can be mindful of that, you make decisions. So I'll give you an example. We didn't call it Feldman and Hunt. We called it Pulse Point because we knew that, a buyer might find that a better way to digest, a brand, for example. Particularly if we got 2, 3, 4 years in, we started documenting processes, repeatable processes, right? So that, again, wasn't just service revenue. We started as quickly as we could. We found a SaaS-like revenue stream. It was a digital tool that you could use to sort of figure out where you were in the transition into the digital world, but it was sold differently than hourly hours, right? And we know that firms get a greater valuation. Okay, so Legend Labs. I'm 62. I've got a son in the business, which, by the way, is another thing I think can factor into these, because I'm really proud to have my son in the business. But it also creates, a little bit of a responsibility, right? Because while I can have a lifestyle firm, he's young. He hasn't had his first child. So to answer your question, day in and day out, we run Legend Labs more like a lifestyle firm than a performance firm. However, last year, fourth quarter, we got 3 unsolicited inquiries about the business. That tends to get your eyes open. And, when they want to poke at it, look at it, what are they looking at? Month over month, quarter over quarter, is the revenue constantly smoothly growing? So you start to become aware of that. And you say, well, look, if we ever do want to sell the business, we better be pretty mindful, of how we're performing. And that, by the way, would include your mix of business, because they'll look at it and say, well, they're over indexed in sports, or too much higher education, or too much low margin business. So as an entrepreneur, if you're one of those that's a serial entrepreneur, being mindful of, what drives valuations early, it's not a bad idea.
Would you encourage entrepreneurs to rethink the hourly billing model, sounds like you did to some degree at Pulse Point? Obviously this is a conversation that's been going on for years. I think generative AI has really brought this conversation up to the top of mind again. Does it really make sense in 2024 for our industry to be charging by the hour? And would you encourage an entrepreneur who's starting today and they have an opportunity to blow it all up to do it differently?
I have not billed by the hour in 15 years. I hate it. I hated it back when I was at Burson Marsteller. I hated it when I was at GCI. I just don't like it. I think that we, now with a young entrepreneur, it could be a little more challenging because, I know what it costs to get things done. I could, even though I may not be able to sit there and do it mathematically calculated, but, when you've been around this business as long as we have, you just sort of know, okay, if I charge them $40,000 for this project, I've got about $25,000 of margin on it. I just know it. So, but yeah, I like project oriented budgets.
But how did you get clients on board? Because sometimes, even for the more seasoned entrepreneurs, the reason they cannot move away from the hourly billing model because that's what their clients expect.
I just tell them that we don't bill by the hour. We find it to be very inefficient. We find that it creates work, by the way, to keep up with the hours that we'd rather be giving to you and dedicating to you. Now, there are some clients that they just, they have to have an hourly calculation. And if we have to, if we bend over backwards, we'll back into the project fee and give them what an hourly calculation would look like. So particularly with crisis work, sometimes we're asked, what is your crisis rate? I'll give them a crisis rate. But if the crisis hits, I'm going to give them a number.
New rate.
That is this is the first 2 weeks, and the week after that's going to be, So anyway, I don't like it, and I don't like what it does culturally. I just feel like, I just don't like it.
And it takes that whole.
We're not lawyers.
Exactly, we're not lawyers, and it takes that whole dynamic. What I like to talk about is sort of that we want to lead and challenge clients, not serve and respond. And if you're serve and responding, by definition, that's hourly stuff. If you're leading and challenging, you're a partner, you're looking around corners, and that we can value that lots of different ways. So yeah, and that may go back to Aarti, to your question. It may go back to the starting point of the entrepreneur. I didn't start with, I've never done hourly in my own iteration, and we rarely, just like Jeff, rarely ever did it at the other firm. But I know lots of folks that are starting out, that's the only way they know how to start out, is that way, is trading an hour for a couple $100. That's just all they know. But I do think we're all going there from a value-based pricing.
So on that note, we talked about the blind spots for someone who's never done the tour of duty at the big agencies. But the blind spot that I've seen for folks that have done their tour of duties at the holding groups is, to some point, Bill, even if they intend to disrupt the system, they're gonna create a new model. at some point, especially as they start to grow and scale, they revert back to what they know, right? And what they were raised in. And suddenly every account structured exactly like, a mini version of Burson or a mini version of Edelman. So again, Jeff, how did you keep from falling into bad old habits?
That's a really good question. And the way that we did it was intentionally, meaning we purposefully created a flat organization. We purposefully made it such that, somebody that's 2 years out of college can be working with me one day, and somebody that's 20 years out of college can be working with me another day, and there's no layers, right? It's all about pooling the talent based on, who has what skill set that you need. And I don't care if they're 18 or 27 or 47, I'm going to get the talent that I need configured the way I need it. And so that's how we did it at Pulse Point. Now, one thing we did do at Pulse Point that ended up being a little bit of a problem is we created kind of what you sort of see like a practice structure. We called them pods. And at the time, it felt like it was the right thing to do, but it ended up creating a lot of bad behaviors. Matter of fact, it's how my two partners and I become partners in Legend Labs, because we were the God Pod. We love working together, but it just kind of created, some internal, internal competition, if you will, that frankly was not healthy. So we have not repeated that at Legend Labs. We keep it very fluid. I was going to mention one other thing before we leave the topic of the entrepreneurs. One of the things that we have done really well at Legend, we didn't do it as well at Pulse Point, is building in incentives, success incentives and fees, and also taking a piece of the action. So we have, just as an example, the reason I was late coming onto this call, we're doing some work for a guy by the name of Jamal Charles. He used to be a running back for the Kansas City Chiefs. He's got a patent for a glove that has a heating element in it so that, you don't have cold hands. And so we're basically taking a 5% stake in that company. We're charging them the out-of-pocket. But, that's fun. That's skin of the game. We have a company that we launched called Better, BETR, with Jake Paul. We got action. We got another company called Simple Bet. And so the opportunity is, and I think clients like it, by the way. They really love the fact that you want to be invested in their business.
Partners you up really closely.
But
it really does.
But I also know agencies that never survived doing that or over-indexed on that in the late 90s, early 2000s, and that disappeared overnight because of it. So how do you manage risk when doing something like that?
You make sure that you get what you need to cover your cost and then some. So I never put our full, for us, the way I do it, it's all gravy. In other words, if you go back and look at the assignment that we did. Now, in the case of Jamal Charles, a little different. We are putting, that's more like the partners have made a decision that we want to invest in that business. But otherwise, you get what you need to more than cover your cost. But rather than taking like a 25% profit margin, maybe you're taking like an 8%, but you have the ability to get to 45%.
Yeah.
If you hit it out of the park.
Right.
That's how we do it.
So, on that note, let's talk a little bit about your client portfolio because, it sounds like you have a mix of startups. And then you also have talked about, you work with the Grammys, you work with the Oscars. I mean, in some ways, it seems like a dream mix. So how do you go about getting your business? How much of it is referral, given the fact that you've been in the business for as long as you have? And then what role do your partners, given that it sounds like they're a bit more junior or earlier in their careers, what role do they play in new business and bringing in clients?
Yeah, 90% of our business, 95% is referral. We don't pitch business, by the way. No, we just don't. I mean, occasionally we have to. Like we University of Virginia is a client of ours. We handled the crisis in the aftermath of the football tragedy. The School of Public Policy, needs some help. They have to go through an RFP process. Okay, we'll do it. But we've got to believe that we've got a better than average chance of winning it, or we're not competing it. We just don't like it.
But how much of that 95% comes from you, and how much of that comes from your partners?
So in the earlier years, too much of it. But as time has gone on, particularly one of my partners, James Wakefield, has really done a great job of building client relationships. He's super creative. He's kind of like Rob Flaherty, honestly. In fact, he's better than Rob Flaherty. he's more
Rob,
creative.
Don't be offended if you're listening to this.
No, Rob would agree with me if he met him. He's just he's super creative. But anyway, he's getting a lot of referral business on his own now. But that's what keeps me up at night, to be honest with you, is that I'm too much of the economic engine for the company. So right now, I would say that would be something that I personally would like to see. And I have brought this up to Bill. We had lunch. I need to really kind of work on getting them skilled at, networking and business development. My son has the gift. I mean, he's very natural at it. So he's starting to, be able to kind of get some repeat business. So like, for example, we'll go in and do a rebrand of the America East Athletic Conference. He's doing all the interviews that we're using with the ADs. And so if one of them has a problem, they're going to call him up. And so he's using that. And so I've seen really good, encouraging signs. But my runway, I'm figuring another 3 or 4 years active. So my runway is getting kind of tight here, that I got to be able to sleep well at night knowing that if I leave tomorrow, the business sustains itself and then some. And that's my biggest concern.
So I would assume if you're transparent enough to share it on a podcast, you've had those conversations with your partners.
Yeah.
You've talked about runway, you've talked about the load of business development, leveling up and things like that.
Right.
Let's talk about transparency firm-wide. Talk about transparency. Does everybody know everything? I mean, salaries, business, dollars and cents. Talk about transparency writ large within your team at Legend Labs.
We don't, not everybody knows salaries, that's for sure. Some people do. In other words, we do have some substructures of like leadership. Like my son Chris has 3 or 4 people that he kind of like tends to, right? So he would know their compensation and be consulted with on their compensation. We don't share our financials, monthly. We do with the partners, and we don't mind telling people if they want to know. I mean, it's not like we're not sharing it. We just don't want to burden the whole organization with, well, your group only did, 30% of what it did. We just keep your head down, do great work, drive great results, revenue comes, profits come. So yeah, we're not sharing that very widely. We're not making that the focus of the firm. The focus is on the work. And we found that really serves us well. I mean, now in terms of transparency on my plans, certainly my 2 partners and my son, have good, transparency on that. And they know that we're shopping the firm every now and again. Not shopping it, but when something comes in, they know, Chris knows, they know, but we're not. And by the way, the phantom stock is set up as a liquidity. It's called what do we call it? See, equity appreciation right. So it's a liquidity equity appreciation right or something like that. But it only happens with a liquidity event.
It goes down with a deal.
So the people know that it only, we have to sell the company.
I want to ask a follow-up. So your son is not a partner, an official partner. So for other folks that work at the agency, how do you, are you okay with it feeling like a family business? Like, is there an assumption that at some point, Chris, I think that will become a partner? And do you worry about sort of creating sort of a nepotistic sort of environment? And how do you protect against that?
Yeah, it's it's something that I would have worried about, but my son has done such an incredible job of, leading through that if you go and talk to any of our people, they'll tell you he's just like one of the guys, right? And so I think, because I've been in situations where, I'm in the company, they're my client, and the kids are like, driving everybody crazy. My daughter worked for us. She was working at an Israeli software firm. She lost her job. I'm like drowning in work. I went to Ahmed and James and said, "Hey, look, she's got some time on her hands. I need some help with my calendar." They said, let's bring her on. So she came on, and she, for about 3 or 4 months, was kind of helping me. And And then she got another job, and nobody wants her to leave. They love her. They love the spirit. So I think it's unique. Everybody would say that they're blessed with their children, but I really do have a very unique relationship, with my son, and he has a very unique relationship. And the way it's set up, when I started the business with James and Ahmed, I was very upfront with them. And I said to them, I want to have, by the way, we started the business in Cuba. We went to Cuba, and that's where we originated the idea. But I said,
that's why there's not transparency.
Exactly.
Because we're incorporated.
Exactly. But I said to them, because I had to make a decision. I mean, I could retire. I could have retired, before Pulse Point. You certainly could retire after Pulse Point. But I said to them, look, what would motivate me to want to do what we do is if I could have a legacy, legend. And I'd love for my son, to come into the business. At that time, he was at the Pac-12 Networks. He was an Emmy Award-winning producer. But I said, if you guys would be open to that and you would welcome him in and you'd be his mentor. And so that's the way it really works, is they have a lot more exposure to him than I do.
Do you hope to pass your ownership stakes down to your son at some point? Okay, that's the plan. All right.
Yeah, and I've talked to Bill about this too. This is another dilemma for me because, he's earning his way into the equity position, right? Meanwhile, my daughter, is not. She's doing her own thing. But when you start looking at your legacy estate, so it's something I'm figuring out. I'm very honest and open with both of them about that too. But yeah, what I think will end up happening is, and I've gotten advice on this too. Don't just give him your equity. Everybody that's advised me saying, look, if he's good enough to become an equity partner, then each of the three partners should contribute equally to his position in the firm. That's what people have told me.
Super smart. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, super smart. Well, hey, let's wrap up on time. So this has been a wonderful conversation. I got one last question that I want to ask you, but thank you. I think your clarity on your journey and what you've shared has been tremendously valuable. So thank you for that. I know that your teaching at UT is a passion for you. I think your gift of teaching comes through. So thank you very much for that. So you've spent a career climbing and succeeding what I call the first mountain, and you've gone up and down your first mountain a number of times. But as a 62-year-old, what are you looking forward to for your second mountain? Do you have a second mountain?
I tune in to good friends like Bill Coletti, who I see on a sailboat, managing
doing a podcast.
Well, first off, even though I say step away, I will not step away in that sense. I might step away from an ownership position, but I role model, Julian Reed, died at the age of 92 and was still giving clients counsel. Harold Burson. So I really don't have any desire to quote unquote retire. I do think that I need to spend some time thinking about, my wife and I are empty nesters now. I do think I need to spend some time thinking about how I can give back beyond what I do at Texas in terms of teaching. And so that is something that, is on my mind. I don't have it figured.
That's great. That's all that segment. So it's not retirement, but with two small letter changes, it's refinement. You're just refining.
Yeah.
If you make two little letter changes, retirement becomes refinement, and you're just looking to refine.
That's right.
That's what you want to
Exactly.
do. Remove the impurity.
Yes. Or as the Gen Xers are calling it, empty nexting instead of empty nesting.
I love it.
Jeff, thank you very much. You are a legend in this business. Thank you for sharing with us. I really appreciate it. Let's stay in touch.
You're too kind. Thank you. Brenna, thank you. You did a great job keeping all this organized.
Yes.
Well, Aarti, I have been just a fan of Jeff's for a really long time. I've just enjoyed getting to know him. We talked a little bit about doing some stuff together back in the Pulse Point days as I was forming and starting Kith, and was nicely reminded of why that would have been something interesting to do. And glad we did that. this notion of legacy, and that relates to the choices that he made with partnership. He said he's 62 and talked about that transition and legacy. He's got a son in the business now. And it's a really interesting perspective that we see a couple of things, trends. One is younger folks coming in to to senior leadership at a firm. That's something that I'm certainly talking about and seeing, but also now he's got his son involved. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that perspective. Are you seeing that legacy works, and how do agencies build on this notion of legacy?
With one big exception, legacy has not worked particularly well in our industry, and I think most of our listeners will know what that exception is. Building a legacy for his son. How do you build a culture around that? And there are a lot of questions I would have. For instance, like how, because the assumption is that Jeff's son will eventually buy his shares. What's his working relationship with the other two partners, right? Like, and I'm assuming the other two partners entered into this deal knowing that, but also, how do you build a culture for all the employees when, you obviously have an heir apparent, and that may work in a larger organization, but in an organization as small as this one, how do you make everybody feel I think heard, and what stood out to me is when we talked about transparency, it sounded like it's not quite as transparent, especially around the business operations, as some of the other business, entrepreneurs that we've spoken to.
It's interesting. We get this common theme about partnership, but insert relationship into partnership. It is really good. And I think Jeff, he signaled it, he said it, and it's sort of obvious. A lot of it has to do with the health of the relationships that they've built with he and his partners. He also referenced that his son kind of is getting it and doing things in a way that doesn't create any sort of unnecessary or unhealthy behaviors. And I've sadly seen that. If anybody watched Succession, we've seen it in its worst possible form. So I think that's really beneficial. The health that they seem to be going through plays out in their transparency. It plays out in the way they go about in doing culture. And so I think there's a lot to learn about, healthy people coming together. If you see something, say something, have conversations, be open and honest and clear. We've had other guests talk about that. I think you and I, as our interaction, we have talked about that. See something, say something. And so I think there's some real benefit, but there were some bad habits, right? Because you don't see that at the big firm.
Yeah. Well, and going back to the culture, one more thing I wanted to add was, it was interesting to me is how much they speak the language of money, right? When we asked, Jeff about, how do you have conversations about performance, and so much of it was rooted in, well, we do quarterly bonuses, and I actually found that to be kind of refreshing. Going back to the conversation we had with Tracy, is sort of this transparency about, we are all here. This is a for-profit business, and rather than sort of saying, oh well, so and so they love what they do, or they love this client, I think having that transparency around money, I think, is really refreshing, and I think that is different than the big agencies. But I think, Bill, you were going to say that if you're an entrepreneur starting today, is that experience at a big agency necessary, or do you pick up too many bad habits?
Yeah, and it's a great question for dialogue, and I don't think it's not certainly my place to be prescriptive in that. I mean, so I did it for 13 years and then went and did my own thing, and was in, 4/5 of that time was in a really, really amazing, hyper dynamic environment at Public Strategies. And then we did the whole Hill and Knowlton thing, and there was kind of a little bit of clash of cultures. But I could see those bad habits getting built. But there's also big paychecks and consistent comp, if you say sort of senior in the firm, that's really frightening when you kind of go for it, as Jeff sort of talked about, that's there. So yeah, I think there are bad habits, but I also know, and you've talked about this very well, there are good things to learn. There's client management skills, there's systems, there's procedure, there's operations. I pulled over all that stuff pick the best of it. So I don't think it's all bad, but I think it's less likely that after a 20-year career at a big firm, you're going to go wing it in a startup. I maybe I'm wrong, but I think that feels like a bridge too far for a lot of people.
But not if you have not if you've already had an exit, right? And I think that's one of the, like we've seen, and Jeff said it during in the conversation that, he could have retired. He could have retired after GCI, and he sure as heck could have retired after Pulse Point, right? But he was motivated to sort of, as you would say, Bill, right, climb another mountain. And it sounds like he was driven in part by wanting to build something that he could then pass on to his son. And everyone's, Feldman's motivation is different on the, he's climbing his third mountain now. So I don't know that like having a tenured career at the big agencies would necessarily preclude someone from, doing the startup game again.
Yeah.
In some cases.
I've got a son-in-law right now who's in the Marines, and he's in his second 3-year contract. And it's an inflection point in that 6 to 10 range for him, because they're going to make it really hard for him to leave. They're going to give him greater responsibility. And all those words I just said sound like big agency words. Going to get greater responsibility, going to get greater comp, and it gets tough. And the real world is not like the Marines. And the real entrepreneurial world is not exactly, Jeff talked about it. He was in an entrepreneurial culture, but without the constraints of an entrepreneurial checkbook. I mean, my pocket has a bottom. And there are some startups that's less so, but for the most part, everybody's got a bottom. Some of these big firms don't have a bottom. And that then goes to this point of performance versus lifestyle. Again, this consistent theme. And I think we've unpacked it and we'll continue to unpack it about our agencies. Should they be built for performance? Should they be built to provide lifestyle for everybody involved, not just enriching the principal? And I think you've got a really interesting take on the public-facing side of that discussion around performance and lifestyle.
Yeah, I mean, when I'd often hear agency owners say that they were mindful of how elaborate their offices looked, in part because they didn't want their clients walking into their office space and looking around and saying, "Oh, so this is what my retainer goes towards." Similarly, I think agency owners they get a little bit prickly when we say that they're running a lifestyle business. Even if on paper it's as clear as day that it's a lifestyle business, they're constantly thinking about how that's going to land with clients. And I don't think that a lot of agency owners want their clients to hear, "Oh, so that's what my retainer's funding your lifestyle." And I think that's a valid concern.
Yeah, and I think those optics are interesting. And so we've spent a couple times talking about this. And so let me leave you with this, and I'd love to get your just off the cuff reaction, and then I want to go deeper with you on this, is that the way I've heard this performance lifestyle distinction is, what if you were to treat your firm as a gold bar, as a solid gold bar, okay? Maybe a kilo or whatever gold bars are measured in. I've never held one. But if you treat your firm as a gold bar or is a gold bar, do you treat that gold bar like a baby where you nourish it and nurture it and want it to have great things and off to college and whatnot? Or is it a thing you slice off every now and then to make an investment, or maybe make a ring out of it, or maybe do something to buy an apartment building, or whatever you would do with a gold bar when you think of it as an asset? So are these firms, in that context of performance and lifestyle, babies, and we treat the gold bar like a baby, or do we treat it like an asset that we can slice off and invest and grow and make other things out of?
I always think about it in terms of margin, right? So like a lifestyle business, it's like Tracy said, right? She has never had to lay anybody off, right? If they lose a client, she figures out how to make it work, how to reassign people, how to maybe have lower margin for some specific period of time. Whereas in a performance, agency, so to speak, you would, you lose a client. Well, all of these people, or at least a portion of them, need to be let go so that we can still make our numbers for this quarter. And to me, that mindset, are you building to sell? So you have to maintain a certain margin pretty consistently, or are you, if it's a lifestyle business, then you can say, oh, you know what, this quarter we're going to take a little bit of a hit, but there's a long-term plan to get us back to where we like to operate.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a continual theme. I think we need to keep asking it, because I think we're going to continue to unpack it and see what people think. I think we're going to talk to some folks that are absolutely performance oriented and are really focused on growth. And so I'm just really curious what the reactions. I think the conversation with Jeff was great. I really, as I mentioned at the top end, a little bit of a fanboy. The fact that he's doing it with his son, the fact that he's got these great partners, that they're doing some really innovative work in the sports place. He's got some things he's working on himself. As a man of a certain age, there are things that become reality that aren't written in the PR manuals, and there are things that are out there. And so I look forward to these generational dynamics and these second mountain conversations that we're going to be having in the future. And I always look forward to having these conversations with you.
Yes, and I'm also looking forward to more of these conversations, and I'm also looking forward to talking to some folks who have not done their big tours at the big agencies in those big jobs and are more willing to sort of break things a little bit and question some of our business practices, because sometimes you need some naivety to do that, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this has been the Heart and Science of Creative Leadership podcast. Thank you for listening. We're excited to share these stories from owners about their methods, their milestones, and their mistakes.